A 7-year-old boy stood trembling on stage as cruel teenagers pelted him with rotten tomatoes, his dreams of singing like Elvis crumbling with every thrown vegetable that stained his white shirt. The crowd's laughter grew louder and more vicious, until a black Cadillac door slammed shut in the distance, and the unmistakable silhouette of the king himself began pushing through the jeering mob. But what happened when Elvis Presley stepped onto that humble stage, that transformed a moment of childhood humiliation into something that would change both their lives forever? The summer of 1974 in Memphis, pressed down like a heavy blanket, thick with humidity and the weight of unfulfilled dreams. Beale Street buzzed with its usual evening energy, but tonight something different pulled at the heartstrings of the neighborhood. Outside the weathered community center, folding chairs sat arranged in uneven rows on the cracked asphalt, filled with families who had gathered for the annual talent show that promised to showcase the local children's abilities. 7-year-old Tommy Jenkins adjusted his carefully pressed white shirt for the 100th time, his small fingers trembling as he gripped the microphone stand. His mother had saved for weeks to buy him that shirt, working double shifts at the diner downtown, telling him that if he was going to sing like Elvis, he needed to look the part. She had ironed it 3 times that afternoon, making sure every crease was perfect, every button properly aligned. The makeshift stage, nothing more than wooden pallets covered with a faded red carpet donated by the local church, seemed to stretch endlessly before him as he looked out at the sea of faces. The evening air hung thick with the scent of honeysuckle and barbecue smoke from nearby porches, where neighbors had gathered to listen from their yards. Children ran between the chairs, their parents calling out warnings to behave, while secretly hoping their own offspring might be brave enough to take that stage someday. The community center's windows glowed yellow behind Tommy, casting long shadows across the assembled crowd that shifted restlessly in the oppressive heat. Behind the crowd, unnoticed by the gathering audience, a black Cadillac Eldorado sat idling at the curb, its chrome bumper reflecting the streetlight's amber glow. Elvis Presley had been driving aimlessly through his old neighborhood when the familiar melody of "Love Me Tender" drifted through his open window, sung in a voice so young and pure, it stopped him cold. He pulled over without thinking, drawn by something he couldn't quite name, his heart recognizing the vulnerability in that small voice that carried across the evening air. Tommy's voice rose into the thick atmosphere, sweet and earnest, carrying the melody with surprising skill for someone so young. His pronunciation was careful, each word enunciated with the precision of countless hours of practice in front of his bedroom mirror. For a moment, the crowd listened with polite attention, some nodding approvingly at the boy's obvious dedication. But as the song continued, and the heat pressed down more heavily, restlessness began to ripple through the audience like wind through wheat. Some had come expecting polished performances, not a child's amateur attempt at channeling the king of rock and roll. The first tomato came from somewhere in the middle rows, thrown by an impatient hand that had grown tired of waiting for real entertainment. It sailed past Tommy's head, missing him by inches, and splattering against the community center's brick wall behind him with a wet splat. Nervous laughter scattered through the crowd like wildfire, breaking the evening spell and transforming the atmosphere from supportive to predatory in a single moment. From his leather seat in the Cadillac, Elvis watched the scene unfold with growing anguish, his hands gripping the steering wheel until his knuckles turned white. The sight of the boy standing alone against the crowd's cruelty transported him back 30 years to his own first performance at the Mississippi-Alabama Fair, when he had been just 10 years old, standing on a similar makeshift stage with nothing but his guitar and desperate hope. The weight of his current struggles pressed down on him like a physical force. His marriage to Priscilla had crumbled just months earlier, leaving him rattled and questioning everything he thought he knew about love and commitment. The divorce papers still sat on his Graceland desk, signed but not yet filed, a constant reminder of his failures as a husband and father. Colonel Parker's demands grew more unreasonable each day, booking him into endless tours that drained his soul and left him dependent on pills just to function. Elvis had not performed a genuine act of kindness in months. Every interaction filtered through handlers and security guards who kept the real world at arm's length. He barely remembered what it felt like to connect with people as simply Elvis Aaron Presley, not as the manufactured image the Colonel had built around him. The pills helped numb the isolation, but they also dulled his capacity for the very emotions that had once made his music magical. As another tomato found its mark, striking Tommy's shoulder and leaving a red stain that spread across the pristine white fabric, Elvis felt something crack open inside his chest. He recognized the look in the boy's eyes, the same desperate hunger for acceptance that had driven him to Sun Records all those years ago, when he had been willing to pay $4 just to make a recording for his mother. The crowd's laughter grew more vicious, feeding on itself like a mob mentality that transformed ordinary people into something cruel and unrecognizable. Tommy's voice began to waver, not from lack of skill, but from the emotional weight of public humiliation. His small hand shook as he gripped the microphone, his eyes scanning the crowd for just one friendly face, one person who might understand that he was giving everything he had. Elvis remembered his own mother's words about standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves, lessons she had taught him during their poorest days in Tupelo, when they had depended on the kindness of neighbors just to survive. Gladys Presley had raised her son to believe that true strength came not from commanding stages or selling records, but from using whatever power you possessed to protect those who had none. The weight of fame had made him forget those lessons, surrounding him with people who told him only what they thought he wanted to hear. But watching Tommy refuse to quit, despite the humiliation, Elvis remembered what courage actually looked like, not the manufactured bravado of his stage persona, but the quiet determination of a child who believed in his dream enough to endure public ridicule rather than abandon it. A rotten tomato struck Tommy directly in the chest, with a wet splat that echoed through the suddenly quieter crowd. The impact knocked the breath from his small body, and the putrid juice spread across his white shirt like a crimson wound, staining the fabric his mother had worked extra shifts to afford. The boy's voice cracked and died mid-note, his small frame trembling as tears began streaming down his cheeks, mixing with the tomato seeds that clung to his collar. The crowd's laughter reached a crescendo of cruelty, people pointing and jeering at the spectacle they had created from an innocent child's dream. Someone shouted, "Get off the stage, kid!" while others applauded the successful hit, as if they were witnessing a carnival game rather than the destruction of a 7-year-old spirit. Tommy stood frozen, still clutching the microphone with both hands, his knuckles white against the black metal, as he struggled to comprehend how his moment of joy had transformed into this nightmare. From his car, Elvis felt rage surge through his body like electricity, burning away the numbness the pills had wrapped around his heart. The sight of that stained white shirt triggered something primal and protective within him, memories of every time he had been mocked for being different, for daring to dream beyond his circumstances. His hand moved to the door handle, without conscious thought, his body acting on instincts that bypassed his mind entirely. The Cadillac door slammed shut with the force of a gunshot, the sound cutting through the crowd's laughter like a blade. Elvis Presley emerged from the vehicle with the purposeful stride of a man who had made an irreversible decision, his presence immediately shifting the energy of the entire gathering. The designer sunglasses came off first, revealing eyes that blazed with an intensity that made nearby spectators step backward instinctively. Whispers began to ripple through the crowd as recognition dawned the unmistakable silhouette, the way he moved with fluid grace even in anger, the aura of controlled power that preceded him like a wave. "Is that really him?" someone gasped, while others fumbled for cameras that would remain unused, too stunned by the surreal moment unfolding before them. Elvis pushed through the crowd with steady determination, his jaw set in a line that brooked no argument. People parted before him like water, their cruel laughter dying in their throats, as they realized they were no longer anonymous faces in a mob, but individuals who would have to answer for their actions. The same hands that had thrown vegetables now hung limp at their sides, shame beginning to replace the mob mentality that had possessed them moments before. Tommy remained motionless on the stage, tears cutting clean tracks through the tomato residue on his cheeks as he watched the legendary figure approach. He had sung Elvis songs 1,000 times in his bedroom, had dreamed of meeting his hero, but never like this. Never while covered in the evidence of public humiliation, never while his dreams lay shattered at his feet like broken glass. The distance between the car and the stage seemed to stretch forever. Each step Elvis took measured and deliberate. The crowd held its collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something that would be talked about for decades, a moment when the king of rock and roll stepped away from his ivory tower to walk among the people who had both elevated and disappointed him. Elvis climbed onto the makeshift stage with the same fluid motion he had used to mount countless professional platforms. But this time, there were no spotlights, no screaming fans, no Colonel Parker hovering in the wings with commercial concerns. There was only a frightened child who needed someone to stand beside him when the world had turned cruel. The king placed his hand gently on Tommy's shoulder, feeling the boy's small frame trembling beneath the stained fabric. "Let's try that again, son," Elvis said quietly, his voice carrying the warm honey tones that had made him famous, but stripped of all performance artifice. He knelt down until he was at eye level with Tommy, close enough that only the boy could hear his next words. "This time, you're not singing alone." The crowd stood transfixed as Elvis began "Love Me Tender" from the beginning, his rich baritone wrapping around the melody like a protective embrace. Tommy's voice joined his hesitantly at first, then with growing confidence as he realized that the man beside him was not performing for the audience, but singing with him, for him. Their voices blended in a harmony that transformed the humid Memphis evening into something sacred and unrepeatable. As they sang, Elvis reached into his pocket and withdrew a pristine white handkerchief, embroidered with his initials in gold thread. Without breaking the melody, he began gently cleaning the tomato stains from Tommy's shirt, his movements careful and tender, like a father tending to his son's scraped knee. The gesture spoke louder than any words could have. This was not the king of rock and roll rescuing a fan, but one human being offering dignity to another who had been stripped of it. The crowd watched in absolute silence, many wiping away tears they had not expected to shed. The same people who had laughed at a child's humiliation now witnessed something that reminded them of their own capacity for both cruelty and redemption. Some tried to capture the moment on their phones, but most simply stood present, knowing they were experiencing something that could not be preserved, only remembered. When the song ended, Elvis stood and faced the audience, his arms still resting protectively on Tommy's shoulder. He did not lecture them or express anger about their behavior. Instead, he simply said, "This boy has more courage in his little finger than most of us show in a lifetime." He kept singing when the world threw everything it had at him. That's not just talent, that's character. Elvis turned back to Tommy and whispered something in his ear that made the boy's face light up with wonder. Then he removed his own silver chain, the one he wore every day, and placed it around Tommy's neck. "Keep singing, son," he said. "The world needs voices like yours." Years later, Tommy Jenkins would become a music teacher in inner-city Memphis, working with children who had been written off by society. He kept that silver chain in his desk drawer, not as a memento of meeting Elvis Presley, but as a reminder that the greatest gift one person could give another was the courage to continue when everything seemed lost. On particularly difficult days, when his students struggled against circumstances that seemed insurmountable, Tommy would tell them the story of the night when kindness conquered cruelty on a makeshift stage, and how a moment of human decency had rippled forward through decades, touching lives that Elvis Presley would never know he had saved.